So in Magic the Gathering, there are definitely many different ways you can go when it comes to kind of figuring out how you want to go about actually improving as a Magic the Gathering player. In today's video, we gotta go through a few steps that I think will help you become an overall better Magic the Gathering player. Hey everyone, it's Scar TV coming at you with another Magic the Gathering video. And in today's video, we are going to be going across ways you can improve yourself as a Magic the Gathering player. With the introduction of mobile as well as being a new way to play the game, I'm sure there are many players who are just jumping in Magic the Gathering for the first time, haven't played it in a while, and are possibly just looking on how to improve their current gameplay, maybe to become that much better of a Magic the Gathering player. With that being said, guys, if you liked the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to know videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But let's dive into the deck. Let's dive into the video and let's talk about how to improve yourself as a Magic the Gathering player. So I think the first key step when it comes to being a Magic the Gathering player and trying to figure out how yourself overall is to kind of understand the strategy you need to go into actually going into a game of Magic the Gathering, coming out with the victory, and that's the plan to win. So the plan to win essentially is, it starts off in the early game stages and eventually gets into late game stages. So in the early game stages, the first thing you probably want to do, the first thing you are going to see when you start a game is going to be, is this a good hand? And this can be answered in many different ways. As you become more knowledgeable in Magic the Gathering, you'll have an understanding of like what's a keepable hand, what is a risky hand, and one is just an overall bad hand. It's one of those things that I think a lot of people are afraid of sometimes, especially being newer players. Taking the mulligan is kind of sometimes a disadvantage depending on the situation, but sometimes a mulligan is what you need. Keeping a hand with 2 lands, but playing, having spells that you can't cast until turn 3 sounds like a complete disaster right off the bat. Keeping a hand with 1 land and too many spells is another one, or even just keeping a hand that is all lands and maybe a spell, also another way to set up for disaster. The other thing you can do in the early game is, even in the beginning of the game, right now in standard at least, possibly in other formats as well, is picking up what your opponent's giving you information wise, from the lands they're playing to if they have a companion, to also maybe even the sleeves or the avatar they may be using. Yes, I mean, sure, not all players actually match their avatar to what style of deck they're playing, but we all know that if they have Lightning Bolt sleeves and they're playing Chandra avatar, there's more than likely a chance of them being a mono red deck. But regardless, picking up the early turns, understanding the mana sources they're playing, certain, decks that are currently popular play certain colors of mana. If you understand that your opponent's playing maybe blue, black, and green, there's a good chance they're playing something like Sultai. If they're just playing red, they're more than likely playing mono red, and they already hit you in the face on turn 1. But with that being said, I mean, picking up these early tendencies will help you kind of understand your best way of strategizing on how to possibly, get that advantage back. The other thing, too, that can actually mess up a lot of people is actually not understanding how their deck needs to start off in order to properly win. We'll go kind of into that a little bit deeper in the video with another step, but kind of understanding your best strategy and how to get out onto the right foot is always a good thing. If you play things like Pathways and the new Snarls, playing that basic land on turn 1 because it comes into play untapped, and maybe playing turn 1 spell is not always the ideal way. You would just realize you've now played your basic land, you have a Snarl in hand. Now that Snarl comes into play on turn 2 tapped. If you would have played it the other way, you would have had a 2-1 tap mana on turn 2. It's just one of those situations you just got to pick up on, and as you kind of understanding, like playing something as simple as playing your lands in the right way or right order is one thing. Also playing your spells in the right order. For example, if your deck runs Heartless Axe and Eliminates and you're in the early game, you're more than likely going to be using Eliminates in the early game, and maybe you want to save that Heartless Axe until they start playing those bigger things that Eliminate can't hit. Things like that are things you definitely want to be looking out for. If they are playing things that like Lovestruck Beast and their 1/1 token, you want to probably get rid of their 1/1 token if they're not really having other ways to produce tokens. Things like that are also things you want to be on the lookout for. Now, get into the more of the late game and more the mid to late game, depending on the style of deck you're playing. Is now you kind of shift our mindset. Is now at this point in the game, you're now trying to look on a way to win. So now we're playing to win in that strategy when it comes to actually creating decks. And the idea here is we want to understand what we're trying to do here now to finish off our opponent. Maybe in the early game we play a lot of control spells and we're just looking for that one big creature just to kind of overwhelm our opponent and just kind of peck them down in chunks of damage at a time. Maybe we're building some sort of combo, like we're playing Witherbloom and we're doing that, trying to go off of Witherbloom combo, and just pinging them with a lot of sacrificing and a lot of life loss and things like that. just trying to figure out those tendencies of, what we're trying to do to now hopefully finish off our opponent. And hopefully at this point, as you're playing your early game, you're kind of setting yourself up to this mid to late game of being able to get to that point of where you can finish off your opponent. The other thing too is if you are playing in this deck and you're worried about, because your opponent's playing this particular card or playing this particular color, you're playing around cards that could happen because of them playing that color. The one thing is, if you start doing that, you start holding back and you start slowing down how you're playing. And that is another thing that you probably don't want to do, because if you're delaying how you're doing, unless you really know that they are playing these spells and you like have some sort of information that they probably have them in their hand, there's no point into playing around them. If you play into it, okay, good on them. But the idea here is, depending on the deck, what is the likely chance of them actually having that card in their hand, or even in some other area of the field that is going to stop you from doing what you're trying to do. So playing around things just because you think they're going to play it is not the best situation. Just play the deck on how it's meant to be played. And usually, we'll say 50-50 right now. It's sometimes of where it will fall. Now, kind of going on to a topic I kind of talked about in this first part is trying to figure out your opponent's strategy. Now, each deck has its strategy of how it's going to be played and how you should play against it. If you're playing against a deck that plays Yorion or plays Lurrus as a companion, you kind of have an idea of what cards to look out for, of what decks they're playing. Yorion decks are usually, for the most part currently, are playing some sort of control or some sort of big late game that they're trying to set up for. They are playing an 80 card deck, so there's also a less likely chance that they may have certain cards in their hand. And when it comes to like Lurrus, most of the cards in that deck outside of spells are on our permanent side, which I should say are 2 mana cost and less. So most of the creatures in there are on the weaker side. Typically with Lurrus decks, you see a lot of rogues, mono white maybes, where Lurrus is actually in the deck. And then, like I said, Yorions were usually around where the Sultai ultimatum style decks, and or also some other control decks depending on that style of matchup. But kind of understanding what cards you need to have in your hand based on this information is definitely a good way to understand, like, another part of what I've already discussed is what to mulligan. So let's just say you're playing a deck that plays like a Lurrus companion, and you're assuming that they're playing, I think currently the most popular Lurrus style companion deck is more than likely the Rogues deck. I know there's also the mono black like enchantment deck, but if you probably guess, it's probably 75% Rogues and 25% mono black or some other style Lurrus deck. But playing like that and kind of understanding what cards I need to have in my hand in order to counter that deck or to have the best chance of winning against that deck is always a good thing. So having this information, being able to play with that information, is understanding of how we're going to make that, how we're going to take the cards we have and slow them down, or just completely ruin their plan. The other thing too is what you want to think about is if you have certain cards out on the battlefield. This kind of a little bit contradicts what I said before, but let's just say you have the advantage. What cards are you looking out for or trying to stop, possibly depending on the style of deck you're playing, that your opponents could play to kind of slow you down? Should you go all out and play your big creature that taps all your mana? Should you leave mana open maybe for that, protection spell or some sort of way to, prevent your stuff from dying? It's kind of one of those things, kind of understanding the situations you need to be on the lookout for. The other thing too is kind of understanding how their decks work, and this kind of gets into the next part after this one, is having an understanding of how their decks work is going to be on the same thing of understanding what cards you need to have to kind of counterbalance on what they're trying to do, slow your opponent down, and overall just kind of getting that overall strategy of what your opponents do. Sometimes opponents play and they just kind of sit back and just play lands, and you really can't get any tell, and that happens. But you can try your best to kind of pick apart what information they are giving you and trying your best to kind of figure out how to slow them down or prevent them from doing. Also, usually if your opponent's not playing a lot of things in the early game, they're just playing lands, they're more than likely a control deck, and they're just waiting for you to do something so they can be reactive. But that's besides the fact. You can always play into it and kind of wait and see kind of thing. Now, like I said before, understanding what your opponent's playing kind of goes into our next part, and that is part of, like, now you want to consume Magic the Gathering content. If you're a newer player, you may just have started in the game, you kind of only understand whether what's in the arena client you're playing, whether it's playing physical Magic, kind of consuming Magic the Gathering content, kind of building that knowledge base of what information is out there. There's a lot of resources out there for Magic the Gathering as a whole. If you're looking for a particular subject, I'm sure you could probably find an article or a write-up or a video on that particular subject. I mean, you're here at this YouTube video watching me talk to you about how to improve as a player, so you're already consuming Magic the Gathering content to become yourself a better player. So that is kind of your way of becoming a Magic the Gathering player, is just understanding Magic the Gathering and what there is, what things people are playing, what cards are popular, what cards aren't popular. Kind of just get, taking it all in is just one good way at building yourself up. The other thing too that that I know Arena doesn't always do, there's a lot of intricate rules to Magic the Gathering that you don't really get in the start. Whether how certain cards resolve, what is considered this, what is considered that. I mean, I had a good example. Someone asked me in a video, I forget which video the topic was on, but they didn't understand that if opponent sacrifices one of their blockers after it was declared a blocker, they didn't understand why the opponent didn't get dealt damage. But it's kind of one of these weird things that if you kind of remove the blocker, but the blocker is already signed, the damage ends up fizzling. That is a weird rule that Magic the Gathering doesn't really tell you kind of how it really works until you actually experience it. And that is kind of one of those things of, okay, I don't understand this. And if you kind of look up rules and based on maybe situations you have, this is just a good way to kind of figure out, oh, this is how that works. And then it kind of goes along into, when it comes to consuming Magic the Gathering content, it comes into the part of the next part, which would be the idea of net decking and building your decks based on information you have gathered. So net decking, and just a real quick, is I feel like, in the earlier days, Magic was probably still a little bit more in its infancies. When it wasn't, I think, when we were still in like the late 90s, early 2000s, the idea of going on the internet and finding like the best decks wasn't as viable as an option as it is today. I mean, you can kind of see that most people, especially when it comes to ranked play, are playing very competitively. They are more than likely playing a meta deck that they either net decked and maybe tweaked a slight bit, or they're just playing a complete copy of, this particular pro who played this deck at, Grand Prix or something like that. Net decking is a thing that's part of Magic. I mean, there's an idea here that if this deck is good and a lot of people play it, there's a reason why, and it's not a bad thing, to pull a deck that's a net deck and play it for yourself. I mean, I'm sure you guys export my decks. I'm not saying my decks are as good as, some meta net decks, but you guys do kind of net deck my decks and kind of try them out for yourself and kind of make your own tweaks based on those style of decks. So I guess in a way that is also net decking. The other thing too, where this kind of transfers, is also building your deck. So if you actually are someone who gets enjoyment out of building a deck, having a knowledge of what your opponents may be playing, what matchups you can go against, may give you an idea of how to build your deck against the meta, and kind of building that anti-meta deck. It's definitely a little bit trickier, especially in Arena as a whole. But I mean, if you play at a local tournament and you go to the card store or the local game store or wherever it is that you play physical Magic, and you have an idea of what the players around you, maybe your group of 8 to like 15, 20. I mean, I don't really know how big, depending on the local game store, how big Friday Night Magic groups are. But getting that knowledge of, hey, person A, B, C play this deck. Person D and E, they kind of switch it up, but they play one of 2 decks. So kind of having that knowledge of kind of, maybe building a deck around that. Maybe they don't play maybe everyone's not really playing a spread of the meta decks, but there's one meta deck that works well against both those decks. Maybe that's the way you need to go when it comes to building a deck, or building a deck that kind of has that focus, trying to build a deck that kind of counteracts it to give yourself the best success. I mean, that's the other thing too. A lot of reason why people build these meta decks or these net decks that you see online that, have high win rates and stuff like that is because, I mean, there's a reason why these decks have high win rates, and that's the reason, people want to win. I mean, it does stink when you do lose a lot and it kind of discourages you, but building a meta deck is one part of it. There's a lot that goes into it as well, but building a meta deck and kind of understanding the meta deck is kind of one part of it. And then playing the deck kind of helps you understand the situations that could come up from the deck. And that kind of goes on to my next part, which is finding the optimal plays when it comes to playing your Magic deck. When you first build the Magic deck, you're kind of still, maybe if you built your own, you're still working out the kinks. You add it in, X amount of each of these cards, kind of slap them together, and you're like, okay, this seems like a logical deck. But until you actually play it, kind of don't understand maybe exactly how it plays, because it's one thing when you rate a bunch of cards on paper, but it's another thing till you play them until you see how it really works. Like, okay, my synergy is this, and I'm playing a game and I'm not getting there. Is it something how I'm playing the deck that's wrong, or is it something when it comes to the back end, when it comes to do I have enough copies of this card, do I have too many copies of that card? Okay, this card's not working out how I wanted it to. And that's the other thing too. You kind of don't see these lines of play that you can play until you actually physically play the deck. Just because the deck's really good and you play it doesn't mean you know how to play the cards the proper way. Just because you're playing a Sultai Ultimatum deck, which is one of the best decks in Standard at the moment, doesn't mean you're gonna win all your games, because there's certain ways you gotta play those cards depending on the situation, depending on how your opponent is interacting with your situation. If your opponent's playing blue and or leaving up mana every single time you look like you're about to tap out, then there's more than likely a chance that they're just waiting for you to play that big old Sultai Ultimatum and for you not to have a follow-up. So understanding what lines you may need to do instead are kind of the ways you have to counteract what your opponent's doing. And it kind of goes into like the previous situations that I've already discussed prior. But like I said, understanding the lines that your deck has, playing the cards in the proper order. Sometimes as well that I do think it's something a lot of people do, especially when newer, is you start your turn, you play your land, you play maybe a spell, and then you attack, and that's your turn. Changing that up is another way that you can change the situation. You start your turn, you immediately go into your attack phase, you attack first. Now it gives your opponent a different strategy of how they have to interact with what's going. Maybe they weren't thinking about removing, but they were thinking about seeing what you were going to play. So now they have to either take the damage for your creature that you're attacking with, or they sit back and maybe you don't play anything. That's the thing. Like you don't play into what they're possibly doing. You just attack as if nothing's going on, and then wait and see what your opponent does. That is a line, and that is a line that I think even a player who's a newer player sometimes doesn't realize is a thing. There is always a second main phase that you can play after your first main phase. So playing that line is always a good logical way. Understanding like the different lines your opponents could have. If your opponent's playing a combo deck, understanding what cards that make that combo click. What's the key card in that line of combo that you need to interact with or stop from really the combo going off. It's just a bunch of various things that, like I said, it's hard to go over all of them because a lot of them can be situational, and depending on the situation, it can vary of how these lines do work. But playing and kind of experiencing different Magic setups is just the best way of kind of really understanding how certain decks work and interact, with certain cards. I mean, the last tip I would say is, practice. The reason why pros are pros is because they commit a lot of time to playing the game of Magic, and they have thousands upon thousands of hours of just playing Magic, maybe even playing a particular deck in Magic. I mean, it's one of those things. It's sure the cards are only, most decks are 60 cards in most formats. But it's mastering those 60 cards regardless of the situation, regardless of the hand you draw, regardless of the cards you're drawing. It's understanding the ins and outs of whether it's your deck, your opponent's deck, the game of Magic. And that's the thing. It takes time to get there, and that kind of goes on to a couple different things that kind of help me improve as a player. The one benefit of me making YouTube videos, when I actually posted YouTube content based on my gameplay. A lot of times when I went to edit and I'd be like, oh, why'd I make that play? I can question myself on why I did this in that situation when I had a clear play that was a better situation. Understanding and questioning yourself on why you do certain things in certain situations, why you didn't do this, which may have also been the more optimal play. Slow yourself down. You don't have to slam a land, slam a creature attacking, and finish the turn. You can I wouldn't say rope your opponent every single turn, but take a little time, do a little bit of thinking process. If you do situation X and it results in Y, is situation Y better? Are the different situations better? Understand what the best situation is. If there's a play that maybe uses all your mana and optimally plays it for your benefit, whether you get more spells out that way, that may be the better play than playing one spell that awkwardly taps 3 of your mana but leaves 1 open. And now you have nothing to do with that mana. Sometimes playing the multiple spells and getting wider or playing certain lines that way are just definitely good. The other thing too is, depending on your situation, I mean, I try my best to do it here, but don't be afraid to ask a question. I mean, there's a lot of things that are very complicated about Magic, even though the game at times can seem very simple. The game of Magic is very deep in rules. There's layers upon layers of rules on why situation. Like I said before, with the attack in and a creature block in, and then the creature gets sacrificed, but the damage doesn't get dealt to a player. That's just one of the many situations. I mean, sometimes there's situations of how the stack resolves and how certain effects work on top of others. That's why you see some of the more high level players playing with manual stacking instead of the game itself figuring out the stack automatically for you. Because if you don't put those cards in a certain way, then a certain situation doesn't work out. Like, for example, playing in a Sultai Ultimatum deck, playing the Vorinclex first, then having the Tibble resolving second, because you want the Vorinclex in place, and when the Tibble comes down on the battlefield, it has double the counters because Vorinclex's ability doubles the counters of a particular card. It's understanding all these intricacies, and And a lot of times, if you don't ask the questions, you're never really going to understand. I mean, the other benefit too is, even asking a question to Google, on, doing a quick Google, like, hey, in Magic the Gathering, why does when a creature blocks, why doesn't damage get dealt to a player? I mean, I'm sure you'll find something. I'm sure it's a question that gets asked quite frequently, especially for newer players. The other thing too is there's many resources out there, other YouTubers, streamers. There's a Magic the Gathering Reddit, I'm sure, out there that you can ask these questions for being a newer player. And there's players all over different skill levels that I'm sure will be glad to answer your questions. And like I said, you can always leave a question here, and I'll try my best to answer it as best as possible, and try to be as clear as possible. Most of the time, I myself, if I'm not 100% sure on how to exactly say it in my own words, I'll look up the rule myself, and I'll just copy and paste you the rule, just because maybe you don't know how to ask that particular question if it's a question on how, like, why certain things work a certain way. And my last thing I would say is have fun. I mean, Magic the Gathering is a game. Sure, you can get super competitive about it, but it's not in a way like, sure, you get a bad run of games and you lost like 5 in a row, 6 in a row, and you lost maybe like a whole placement in the ranking ladder as you're ranking up. And it's frustrating. But at the end of the day, take a deep breath. Kind of, maybe step away from the computer or the mobile phone or the tablet, whatever you're playing on, and just, come back and, just do it all over again. Because each time you play a game of Magic is a new game. It's different than the last. Your opponent's a different possible person unless you somehow match up against the same opponent. But guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But I'll see you in the next Magic the Gathering video.